Thanks, Leah. And hello, everybody, and welcome back. Thank you for coming back. My name is Olivia Dill. I'm a PhD candidate in the Art History Department at Northwestern, and I am very pleased to be able to moderate today's panel with 3 talks on the topic of shape. And so I'm sure you're all pros at this by this point, but I'll just reiterate. So we won't be having introductions for each of our speakers, but I invite you to look in the chat for a link that will take you to their bios, as well as also a link to the abstracts for today's talks. And we will be watching the Q&A, watching the chat rather, for questions, and you can enter your question in its full glory in the chat at any time during any of the talks. And we will get to as many as we possibly can in the Q&A session after all of our speakers have presented their talks. We'll do our best. We might not be able to get to everything. And also, there's also going to be another link floating around in the chat to be able to access live captioning that's going to be happening outside of Zoom for this session. And also just another reminder that we're going to try and record the majority of the talks today. And so just to be aware of the recording on. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to our first speaker, Alicia Caticha, with our first talk of the session.
Thank you so much, Olivia, and thank you, a warm thank you to the organizers of this wonderful 2 days. My doctoral career and research sort of jumped off from a summer fellowship at the Newberry many years ago, and so it's really a pleasure to be back, if virtually. So I shall begin. In August of 1769, the 18th century philosopher Denis Diderot boasted to his lifelong companion, Sophie about his recently completed philosophical dialogue, D'Alembert's Dream, writing, quote, "It was actually quite clever to put my ideas in the mouth of a man who is dreaming. One often has to lend an air of folly to wisdom." Unquote. This wisdom, a radical theory of human biology and evolution, is not the subject of my talk today. Rather, I turn to the folly, in which Diderot humorously offers up a marble sculpture for edible consumption as a means of playfully introducing theories of matter to a decidedly skeptical 18th century audience. But first, let me set the scene. D'Alembert's Dream opens with an imagined dialogue between Diderot and his co-editor of the encyclopedia, Jean-Léon d'Alembert. Right up front, Diderot challenges D'Alembert to question the existence of a god. If God doesn't exist, D'Alembert asks, how does sentience come into being? What is the difference between a man and a statue, between marble and flesh? To all of this, Diderot cheekily responds, not very much. Indeed, 18th century materialists, Diderot among them, opposed the Cartesian dualism between the mind and the body in favor of one substance, matter. Diderot's own understanding of materialism was largely influenced by the Epicurean philosopher Lucretius, whose On the Nature of Things, written circa 50 BCE, argued that everything, even something as immaterial as the soul, is comprised of atomic particles constantly in motion. Although Diderot's own use of the term atom is largely inconsistent, the didactic nature of this curious text reflects his commitment to elevating matter to a primary subject of study. It is also a clear example of the philosopher attempting to aid a reader's tactile comprehension of themselves as a material body. It is within this context that the fictional Diderot more fully answers D'Alembert's question regarding the difference between man and statue. What you do to food, Diderot tells D'Alembert, I will do to marble. This distasteful image of eating marble succeeds insofar as both D'Alembert and the reader become acutely aware of their own corporality, their status as mere matter. The conversation that follows is worth quoting at length. Oh, apologies. Got a little spoiler there. D'Alembert. Making marble edible doesn't strike me as a very easy thing to do. Diderot. I see that it's up me to explain this method to you. I will take that statue you see there, put it in mortar, and after a few good blows with my pestle, not so fast, please. This statue is one of Falconet's masterpieces. Of course, if it were by Juez or one of the others, Falconet wouldn't mind. The statue has been paid for, and Falconet gives little enough thought to his present day reputation, let alone his future glory. Go ahead then, grind it up. 18th century readers would have immediately recognized the reference to Falconet's 1763 Pygmalion and Galatea, which was known as Falconet's masterpiece throughout the period. Less recognizable, perhaps, is the allusion to Diderot and Falconet's private correspondence. Making reference to their heated debate regarding the role of posterity in artistic production, the irascible Falconet maintained that as soon as a work was paid for, it was out of sight, out of mind. By placing Falconet's masterpiece under threat, Diderot was in many ways testing the limits of Falconet's claims and reveling in the absurdity that an artist could allow something created from his own chisel, something essentially of himself, to be pulverized. In this respect, Diderot allows the subject matter of Falconet's sculpture to act as a metaphor in its own right. When Falconet first exhibited Pygmalion and Galatea, his audience was familiar with numerous painted representations of Ovid's myth, in which the mythological sculptor Pygmalion fell so deeply in love with his statue Galatea that she was transformed from statue to life. Two notable examples are these canvases by Raux and Lemoyne, both of whom use chromatic means to convey Galatea's transformation. And we can see at them, their legs are very much more marble than their upper bodies. It's also notable that in the 18th century, Galatea was transformed from the ivory in the original Ovid to marble in these recounts. In viewing Falconet's marble group, the audience, therefore, would have immediately understood Falconet's intended goal, to communicate the transition from marble to flesh using the very material Pygmalion used to carve Galatea. This is mapped out via the group's three main figures: a kneeling Pygmalion who looks up in awe at his creation, Galatea. And although her eyes are half closed, refusing to meet his insistent gaze, we begin to see her animation through what appears to be flexing fingers of her left hand. And we see this right here. The third figure, a small Cupid, levitates on a cloud. Grasping onto her hand, the Cupid kisses it, seeming to imbue her static form with life through divine intervention. However, upon viewing the marble group from behind, one is witness to a second metamorphosis. A voluminous textured cloud resembling eroded stone contrasts against the smooth contours of the polished human flesh. By alluding to the raw or organic material of marble, Falconet's sculpture is not merely a representation of Ovid's myth, but rather a declaration that Falconet is himself embodying the role of Pygmalion. Reframing the subject matter through a uniquely self-referential lens, the divine forces that supposedly animate Galatea are rendered obsolete in light of the artist's skill. In his Salon of 1763, Diderot commended Falconet for his ability to convey such a metamorphosis and transcend what Diderot saw as the material constraints of marble. At times so enthusiastic that it verges on panegyric, Diderot's text mirrors Falconet's attempt at a dual metamorphosis, tracing both the transformation of Galatea from marble to life and the transformation of Falconet's sculpture from marble to life. Diderot begs the viewer to reach out and touch it. Quote, "How soft the flesh. No, it cannot be marble. Put a finger on it. The hardness of the material is gone. It will give beneath your touch," unquote. Just as Pygmalion would feel the warmth and elasticity of Galatea's newly animated flesh, the viewer witnesses Falconet's masterpiece come to life through similarly tactile means. Although Diderot would playfully offer up Falconet's Pygmalion for dinner just 6 years later, it was clearly no mere joke that he selected sculpture to illustrate such materialist animation. This was in part due to Diderot's deep ontological understanding of sculpture as inseparable from the block of marble, inseparable from its original matter. Foreshadowing the prose to come in D'Alembert's dream, Diderot turned his attention to the sculpture yet to be carved in 1765, and I quote, "Voila, a block of marble. The figure is there. One need only to extract it," unquote. Regardless of subject matter, sculpture and marble were irrevocably linked. Returning to D'Alembert's dream then, Diderot's whimsical, edible sculpture thought experiment reveals itself to be a much larger, extended metaphor linking human and sculptural animation through a materialist understanding of proto-atomic matter. Just as Falconet used one material, marble, to metaphorically animate the Pygmalion myth, Diderot saw Falconet's masterpiece as an allegorical response to the question of sentient existence in light of his atheistic worldview. Falconet carved from a single block of marble a world unto itself, featuring enamored artists, marble statues, and uncut stone. Diderot viewed himself in relation to the non-sentient matter around him in a similar mode, all coming from one block of marble. Taking up his own chisel, his pen, he completes the edible metaphor at last. Diderot describes the act of pulverizing the statue, dissolving it in water to create a paste that will be composted and added to the soil of a vegetable garden. Upon eating the resulting peas, beans, cabbages, and other legumes, his body digests and makes sentient the previously unfeeling marble statue. Diderot's fictional animation of Falconet's Pygmalion and Galatea is decidedly pragmatic, taking up the novel idea that human, marble, and vegetable are all made from the same proto-atomic matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that really exciting talk, Alicia. And so quickly, I'm going to pivot us over to our next talk by Ingrid Greenfield. On this panel.
Thank you very much, Olivia. I'm just going to share my screen now. And thank you very much to everybody at the Newberry and at Northwestern for making this conference happen. And it's a real pleasure to speak on this panel with Alicia and Ingrid. And I'll be continuing their themes about metamorphosis and environmental transience by showing you a silver basin made in 17th century England. And the title of my presentation is The Shape of Water. The Silver Dolphin Basin, made by Christian van Wijnen in 1635, asked its early modern users to consider the liquid properties of water. The dish has an undulating rim formed by the meeting of two dolphins, water streaming from their mouths down into the pool below. The rippling, swirling details and the contorted sculptural forms emulate the shape-shifting element of water as a site of transformation and reflection. Water, in this case, becomes a medium for thinking, bringing to the fore the turbulent restlessness of objects and the way they resist elemental categories, material, economic, and imaginative. In this paper, I will explore the early modern user's experience of the water basin in conversation with the material properties and processes of its creation and effects. The basin is seen as a waterscape, an environment created by the liquid properties and material metamorphosis of the silver itself. The investigation will be a provocation to explore what the political theorist Jane Bennett describes as, quote, the shimmering potentiality and violent vitality to matter. The aim of doing so ultimately is to ask further questions about how early modern materials are actively and deeply enmeshed in a watery social ecology of global maritime trade. Marine themes were considered appropriate decoration for drinking and washing vessels in early 17th century England because of the clear association between form and function. The diner using this preening mermaid ewer would hold their hands over the scallop-shaped basin whilst warm perfumed water was poured from the vessel, flowing out through the fantastical creature's nipples. Such objects played a role in the ceremonial life of the royal court, often kept on display. They were exchanged as New Year or ambassadorial gifts. The acquisition of these fashionable, precious items involved considerable financial expenditure and emphasized the status of the owner. Moving beyond the interpretation of aquatic symbolism as a reflection of courtly display, such objects also serve to ignite challenging questions about the representation of nature and the agency of matter. The basin known as the Dolphin Basin was made by the Utrecht goldsmith Christian van Wijnen for an elite patron, likely for the court of Charles I of England, who paid the artist an annual stipend from 1630. It is a large platter size and weighs about 1.5 kilos. This was an object that was intended to be admired from all angles. Detailed graphic attention has been paid to the reverse, where the artist's signature is carefully carved. The upper edge is lipped for the purpose of hanging for display when not in use. The object is of the type found in elite collections or cabinets of curiosity, and was lauded not only for its appearance, but also for the skill of the artist, the performance of the precious metals, and the feeling of wonder it inspired in its beholders. Raised from a single sheet of silver, highly skillful chasing and embossing techniques have been used to sculpt and mark the illusory surfaces of the dish, the seductive iridescence of the partially polished metal, and the naturalistic rendering of the dolphin's skin. The dolphins form the shifting boundaries and borders of the vessel, whilst in the basin, creatures struggle and squirm. When handled before inquiring eyes in the evening candlelight, the silver material implies the restless motion and shape-shifting properties of liquid itself. The production of the watery effects are enhanced by the way the forms dissolve into one another. They are pulled in and out of abstraction. They swell and sink. In stylistic art historical terms, the nebulous, lobate, fleshy or amorphous design features of the dish are categorized as auricular ornament, or in Dutch, kwap. The genesis of this style in the period is associated specifically with the Van Wijnen family of Utrecht goldsmiths. Yet whilst ornamental designs are often thought of as applied to the surface of an object, the active properties of the silver material and its liquid formation collapse the boundaries between form, function, decoration, and matter. This emulation of the qualities of water helps us to think actively with the silver matter. Following the ancient elemental schemata that all matter is combined from earth, air, fire, and water, mined substances such as silver and gold were thought to be formed in the ground from the petrification of water. In early modern metallurgical treatises, this watery formation of metals is defined through their shared properties. While stones are dry and earthy, metals, moist and aqueous, are thought to have originated from liquids. They are described as juices, not as solids. In the second half of the 17th century, this view was subject to the experimentation of the natural philosopher Robert Boyle, who makes frequent references to precious metals and gemstones as putrescent liquors and lapidescent juices that concrete. Metals have a propensity to flow like liquids, which in turn encourages us to adopt an ecological type of thinking, to consider the role of the early modern elements as transformative combinations in the production and effects of objects such as the dolphin dish. To enable objects to exceed their mute, inert status, to underline the status of matter as active, we might question how early modern sensory regimes are found to be in dialogue with matter. What emotional desires and bodily sensations are evoked in the physical and imaginative encounter with the morphing shapes of the platter? Is it cold and wet to the touch, uncanny, repellent, or unsettlingly fluid? Contact with this basin harnesses the flow of the seas, the state of the waterscape as an experience of global discovery. In the context of the emergence of early modern mercantile trade, global exploration, and commercial expansion to new territories, what can the Dolphin Basin tell us about the seas? Oceanic spaces were traced by the materials that flowed through the veins of global trade, transfiguring as they changed hands. 17th century trade depended upon complex exchanges of material goods across different territories. Sea travel is integral to the composition of the Dolphin Basin. What can be revealed about this object by thinking through the watery moments of contact that have marked its journey thus far? In the quest for property, English collectors traveled via ship to continental Europe to gather rarities and artworks. Van Vienen and artists from the Netherlands and other parts of Europe migrated to London to work. Where was the silver bullion mined that was melted down and transformed into the refined single sheet manipulated in London into the form of a wondrous courtly dish? Where did the materials come from and where were they going? Was it mined in Peru or Mexico by Spanish ships traveling to Southeast Asia to trade with English and Dutch merchants for Indian textiles and Chinese silks and porcelain? When did it arrive in Europe? How did it find its way to the Van Vienen workshop in London? The economies at play in this silver object include a mining of human and material resources that coalesce in its iridescent surfaces. What role then do the elements play in the territorialization of raw matter transported across the globe and inserted into 17th century commercial markets of value and exchange? The fact that no work done by Christian Van Vienen for Charles I survives is a reminder of the capacity of metals to morph into something else, to be melted down and used for payment, or refashioned into a more useful or ostentatious version of the original. The liminal state and watery matter of this object is palpable in its final form. Its physical and imaginative journey, however, does not end here. It always threatens to change its shape, to become something else. The dolphin dish materializes and shapes and the shapes and effects of water and points to the instability of the elements as a schema for classifying the components of matter. Considered within this context, the Silver Basin is alive and active as a conduit of materials, cultural communities, and elemental processes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie. And so we're going to transition to the Q&A now. And I'm going to ask if anybody has any questions, please enter them in full into the chat. And we'll call on you likely to ask your own questions aloud. And so just to give everybody a second to let things percolate and marinate as your questions come to you. I'll just say that I think your papers for me are really exciting in asking us to think about malleability of form and also the malleability and like transitions in matter that come with that, and how those transitions manifest very specifically in different media. And also something that was really interesting to me is the spectrum of responses to that malleability from sort of joy or delight and wonder, also on the other end, dread or fear or anxiety. But one question I wondered if we could talk a little bit more about is, we talked a lot yesterday about the role of sight, or about the role of discernment in learning about and in engaging with matter. And I wondered something that seemed evocative in Alicia and Sophie, your talks, especially, and maybe in Ingrid's as well, is the role of other senses beyond sight as mediators with matter. So I wondered if you had any further thoughts on the role of perhaps touch or also taste, maybe, as they're functioning in your works.
Yeah, I can go first. Touch definitely is something that, yeah, I thought I was thinking about a lot in your paper, Alicia, and particularly with, in my kind of thinking around water in this period, touch becomes in one of the senses that is most closely associated with water. And something I've looked at briefly is the prints of the four elements as they're associated with different senses. Water and touch are kind of very clearly aligned together. And then also, I guess, in relation to the work of silversmiths and goldsmiths, the hallmarking of those works is called the touch. So yeah, I don't know, Alicia, if you want to.
I was thinking just a brief aside with your paper, Sophie, the idea of touch is sort of also elusive when thinking about touching water. The water is constantly, you can't hold it, right? It's constantly flowing through your fingers. So it's got this interesting elusive element to it. And with regards to marble, touch and sculpture have a moment in the mid-18th century. We get Herder, Winkelmann, Lessing, all of these guys sort of reevaluating touch. And of course, Diderot is the main guy for this, really. I mean, he's literally begging us to touch sculpture, right? And when I was thinking about linking this to how Diderot is trying to reformulate matter, how he's trying to communicate that we all are part of, all matter is made from the same atomic materials, even though he doesn't necessarily at this point have the language of atoms and molecules down. I was thinking he's very adamant that sight is an illusion. Sight doesn't necessarily communicate to us precisely this idea of matter, this idea of transformation, because of these illusionistic properties. And that's sort of why I think, although in his salons, he loves painting, he is always effusive about painting and can often be very scathing when it comes to his reviews of sculpture, he turns to sculpture as a means to understand this, because it removes that illusionistic quality and he sees the forms as being linked to touch and matter. And of course, Jacqueline Lichtenstein's tome of a excellent book, The Blind Spot, really goes into Diderot's relationship with touch and how it's intrinsic to his understanding of matter and experiencing the world through that lens, that we are all of the same matter.
Just to respond quickly, I think There's quite a bit of work done on 19th and 20th century practices in West Africa based on field work that established that, at least dating back to the 19th century, there's definitely a deep understanding of clay coming from certain parts of the termite mound as being especially fine, certain qualities that the clay coming from certain parts is moist and valuable for sculpting, or potentially better for eating. And it's really used so broadly across material cultures in West Africa, as I mentioned, with surfacing of houses, covering reeds, using it to polish or give a patina to objects. So that sense of tactility of the clay is really highly valued. And then, of course, another sense is taste, because termites are pretty widely eaten as a source of protein. And the communities are highly attuned to the life cycles of the termites. So when the sexually reproductive termites emerge as a group, these are the ones with wings that go off to form their own communities. That's when, other megafauna, and including humans, gather around and eat them.
So I'm gonna pass it over to Claudia. Would you mind unmuting and asking the question that you posed in the chat?
No, not at all. It's a bit of a tangent though. And right now I'm just completely taken with whether I would rather eat termites or marble. I'm really not sure. I can't say. My question had to do with other matter entirely, which is shells. But of course, shells have a relationship to marble, and then shells are architectonic, and shells have a very obvious relationship, I think, to the forms of the Fonfian and basin and silver work of that moment. And I just was curious whether that had figured at all, but that was just, as it were, food for thought. I think if the termites were covered in sugar, it would be okay, which was another question I had, but we can.
Well, my great-grandfather was an entomologist at the University of Michigan, which is why I started paying attention to this. And recently we've started to, there's been work at the University of Wisconsin where they're really trying to promote protein, insect-based protein, and some of that includes termites. So
yeah.
Thinking out loud about just the idea of shells, because I have been recently sort of thinking about them as in terms of, I'm an 18th centuryist, so we love a good rocaille shell, right? And thinking about what that means in terms of sculptural production, and them being this emblematic force of the natural world that becomes so artificialized and becomes a symbol of the Rococo period in this artificial, decadent manner. But I've been thinking mostly in terms of its whiteness and how it is this item that sort of is of nature and yet has, in the 18th century worldview, notions of purity involved with it, which in many ways, I think marble also connotes this item that comes from the earth and yet has this aura of purity that is, of course, culturally constructed. Want to be very clear about that, because, and there's lots of thinking about that. How do you, if something connotes purity when it comes from the earth, which certainly Ingrid's talks about, I think really highlights this, but well, where was my train of thought going? I got distracted thinking about termites in this conversation. But it's really interesting. How do you negotiate the alternative of this? Diderot is notably comes up with these ideas after a particularly rowdy, drunken night at the Baron de Holbach, who is a naturalist and salon host, and who does Baron de Holbach writes the entry of marble in the encyclopedia, and for geology, not for sculpture. And so he's very interested in the defects of marble. And that's where I was going with this idea of purity, these defects. How do you negotiate that? And he's very conflicted when he has to address the idea of marble sculpture and human form in marble sculpture. What do you do with these veins? He doesn't quite know.
I think there's so many great questions. Let me know. And yeah, thank you so much.
So there are a couple questions in the chat on the theme of consumption. And so can I ask Christine Gutler if you'd like to unmute and ask your question?
It was three fascinating papers, and I was particularly taken, in a way it plays a role in all three papers, but particularly with Alicia and Ingrid, consumption in very different ways. Sort of a marble sculpture which is consumed because it becomes dust and can be eaten. And in fact, idols that are consumed by termites. So it's sort of about consumption in its double role, and probably plays a role, I don't know, playfully with Sophie's paper as well, because it's such an important term. I don't know whether you would like to, I found it very striking.
Yeah, the intricacy of the way that consumption and the breaking down of materials also is implicitly part of the building up of these massive structures is a tension which I'm not sure that my sources explicitly recognize, actually. Like, I think that's an interesting blind spot before we get to the 18th century, the relationship between destruction and nourishing the ground, nourishing the soil, which leads to growth and this sort of sustainable cycle. The Europeans tend to see termites as totally a destructive force across the tropics, and then they are widely noted, I think, across all areas of places where Europeans are colonizing. And certainly local sources are also informing the Europeans of their destructive potential. But what they're not registering, the Europeans, I mean, is that deeper understanding, which I think is often kept private, is kept secret and not spoken about to these outsiders, that sees this human beings as part of a world in which termites are an important creature. And I think when we're thinking about sources and where Europeans are getting information from, of course, we're more and more paying attention to the fact that there were likely deep lacuna in European knowledge because they were not being told certain things. And that's interesting to note, especially because now we're finally coming around in Western science, as I said, to understanding the relationships between macronutrients or microorganisms, even within the termites, and how they might relate to the fungus that's grown, and on and on. So there's consumption at every level.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I find so interesting. You know, it's sort of the various designs of life cycles that play a role in all of the papers. In fact.
Yeah.
And I would add that just when Ingrid was talking about this conversion of idols to termites, from termites to soil, I was immediately thinking, I mean, I couldn't believe that these two papers, what luck to have them in dialogue. And I would just, I don't really have much to add, because I think that Ingrid's answer actually, it applies to my paper very well. But it is notable that Diderot wants you to linger with the shock of the idea of marble before he drags out the shock of his reader and of D'Alembert. before he tells you, oh, I'm going to compost it and like make it part of this larger life cycle, precisely because he knows that there's a corporal response he's going to get from his reader, feeling that corporality. The idea, he lets you linger with the idea that you're going to be forced to eat this marble. And then he's like, oh, no worries. It's part of this larger life cycle. So
and that, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, just a wonderful instance of it, you really see the humor at play.
And that there would be purposeful destruction of something that's man-made and this man-made artistry. I think that's only something that in the 20th century art historians have started to grasp when it comes to African objects, and that the idea of a certain lifespan or of a spirit living way beyond the physical object in this world, or the power passing from object to object and yet retaining something of its originality. Like that's something that's been too hard for us to understand before the past couple decades.
And I wonder if, Sophie, maybe you can speak to that point that Ingrid just made about the instability of the life cycle, because I feel like water is incapable of capturing, so it's always ephemeral in some way. I don't know, I'm thinking out loud.
Yeah, no, I think that this idea of a life cycle, whereas I'd kind of thought about it in the timeline of the material and the ways of the silver dish and the ways it had kind of come to be in a cabinet in the British Galleries at the V&A. But I also think in terms of consumption and digestion, that's a really nice way to further develop those ideas. Obviously, there's the kind of consumption aspect of the fact that it plays a role in kind of the life cycle of the meal in dining, in its use, kind of the washing of the hands used with the basin before and after the meal. But then, of course, in terms of conspicuous consumption, and objects that are produced for display, and therefore, their power is also held in their capacity to display a certain type of status. So in that kind of brings in an instability and a temporality, like what is valuable when, and if it is melted down and changed into something else, why has that happened, and what does it get changed into? So that kind of Ingrid's point about the destruction of man-made things, particularly with gold and silverware, is really much more common that they are melted down and changed into something else, refashioned, partly because of their value, their kind of economic, the way they're inserted into a kind of life cycle of minted coins and bullion, and what you exchange for what, where, and when. And then also, because of their capacity to display a different type of power in different shapes and forms.
So there's a question from Jennifer Rampling. Would you mind unmuting and asking, please?
Yes, thank you very much. Wonderful papers. My question was specifically for Sophie. I wondered if you could perhaps situate that wonderful silver basin in relation to other kinds of display plate or display table objects of the early modern period, which might evoke nature and the elements in similar ways. And I was thinking in particular of Bernard Palissy's famous ceramic centerpieces, which were often made by life casting of snakes, frogs, other kinds of creature, which we might perhaps think of as evoking the element of earth more than the element of water. And thinking down these lines got me really wondering about the ways in which elements are invoked by the presentation of these display pieces. So the silver basin evokes water, but of course, to melt the silver, the production requires fire, just as the production of ceramic pieces, which might evoke earthiness, require water, but the water disappears and the fire passes. And I wonder if it was a kind of lost element story here. But mainly I was just interested in putting ceramic earthy pieces alongside these metallic watery pieces, and just to get a sense of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I'm like scrolling through and I can't see you, so it's a bit like a disembodied voice. But yeah, so in terms of the Palissy pieces, I think they're kind of, I think you're absolutely right. There's this like, the elements can really be harnessed in all of these different ways, and with Palissy, the capacity to create a kind of a waterscape that draw, you know, kind of an environment that really draws on natural representations in a way that's very focused in the process of its making, as you very eloquently described, kind of all the processes of firing and kind of where those presentations come from. The thing that it feels to me the most like Palissy in the dolphin dish is that really naturalistic rendering of the skin. It kind of looks like so many natural historical representations. In terms of, what was the question? Sorry, at the beginning of the question, you asked about the way that different plate might be, the context of the dolphin dish in relation to other types of silver and gold plate. If I understood that. Yeah, it's unusual. Like it very much was. We know that silver produced by Van Fine and for Charles I was in the cabinet rooms at Whitehall, and so I guess there's a difference maybe to be a distinction to be made between something like this dish and the type of basins and dishes and tableware that were in kind of everyday use. It wasn't the dish wasn't hallmarked. Things for the king are not hallmarked using a goldsmith's hallmark, but it was signed by Van Fine, and so it's kind of signed and it says the year that it was made on the back, which is something that perhaps, you know, puts it in the category of something that was regarded very much as a precious sculpture, but filling it with water. And it would have been, you know, such a part of the kind of delightful way you could interact with the elements and engage with that dish, even in that kind of cabinet room context, I think.
Thank you. So we're exactly at 12:30, so I'm gonna close us out now, but not before we say all together a final thank you to all of our panelists for their lovely presentations, and thank you also all of our participants for really stimulating and an engaging discussion afterwards.